The Rinnegan is obviously the strongest type of dojutsu in the Naruto series. It has so many different abilities and so much versatility. One of the craziest abilities is the ability to summon different types of beasts through the animal path. The animal path by itself is already a very powerful tool in the Rinnegan arsenal with so many different summons. You can do so much stuff with it. You can fly with a bird, you can use them to attack. You have several extremely powerful summons such as the rhino, the multi-headed hound. You can conceal yourself with a chameleon by just turning invisible. You can use that panda as a shield. It's just so much different stuff. I could even argue that the multi-headed hound is the strongest summoning in the entire series except for tail beasts, because every time it gets hit, it multiplies its heads and it can also split its body like a clone. That summoning is ridiculously strong. The animal path by itself was tying against base Jiraiya. And this is a pretty big deal because it's just one path of pain against Jiraiya, a legendary Sanin. Now, you can say Jiraiya had to keep his hands together in order to summon Ma and Pa, and so he wasn't as powerful as he could have been, but you can also see in the fight that Jiraiya was on the run against the animal path, so it's not as though he was beating just the animal path by himself. He needed Sage Mode. The question is, where do all these summonings come from? Because if you think about it, every single other summon that we know, well, they come from somewhere. The toads come from Mount Myoboku, the snakes come from the Ryuchi cave, and the snails come from the Shikotsu forest. The tail beasts usually are just roaming around the world when they are not sealed inside a Jinchuriki and they are summoned from that particular place. And sure, we don't know the places where the dogs, the Kakashi summons come from, but they definitely come from somewhere equivalent to the Mount Myoboku thing. But to think that's the case for the Rinnegan summonings is a bit naive, because first of all, they are all different species. Second of all, they don't really resemble animals as much as they resemble monsters, because they look extremely terrifying, unlike the other summonings, which can be frightening, but they are just animals, but bigger, if that makes sense. I mean, this bird here looks like he's been in Chernobyl for too long. Are you telling me that they have a place like that in the Naruto world? Because I don't think so. And you know what the crazy thing is? These summons are immortal. Let me explain. When Jiraiya fought Pain, remember when he summoned Ma and Pa, and the little frog spat that jet of water that cut the chameleon in half, sending blood everywhere. It was a bloodbath. And what do you know? In the war arc, Nagato is using the chameleon again to fight against Naruto and B. Also, Jiraiya uses a massive toad stomach to destroy the multi-headed hound, and yet the hound is used again in Pain's invasion of the Leaf Village and also in the war arc. Jiraiya also toasts the bird with a fire style jutsu, and the bird is just fine in the Pain invasion and also in the war arc. It really seems these things cannot be killed, essentially. Another very peculiar thing about the summons is that they all have the Rinnegan. And you may say, well, but that's fine, because when Sasuke or other Uchihas use the Sharingan to control summons, the summons also acquire the Sharingan. But this is not quite the same thing for Nagato, because Nagato didn't really know how to use the Sharingan slash Rinnegan like that. He could only use the base ability, so he couldn't control beasts through Genjutsu. And yet, they still show the Rinnegan. But that's because there's another very peculiar thing about these summons. They have the Rinnegan rods implanted into their bodies, meaning that Nagato could control them just like any other Pain body. The Rinnegan rods are what actually empower the Rinnegan into the summons. That's how Nagato does to create the paths of pain. By implanting the Rinnegan rods, the Rinnegan itself is transmitted within the bodies, and he also gets the shared field of view, which is also very advantageous. Obito does the exact same thing when he implants Rinnegan rods into the Edo Tensei Jinchurikis, but in that occasion, because Obito had only one Rinnegan and the other eye was a Sharingan, the Jinchurikis also depicted a Rinnegan and a Sharingan, but they still had a shared field of view. And we can see that, yes, the animal path summons also share their field of view with Nagato when, in the war arc, Hitachi has to destroy their eyes with Shuriken Jutsu so that he can save Naruto and B from certain death. Yet, I'm not so sure if Nagato himself was the guy who implanted those Rinnegan rods into those summons, because they seem to be much more like a thing that they're by default just what the animal path can do. For instance, plenty of summons were destroyed during the Pain invasion, and granted, the multi-headed hound wasn't technically killed. Gamabunta and the other frogs were just sitting on the big dog so that he couldn't move, and then the animal path was defeated and they just disappeared out of the battlefield, because if they were destroyed, then Nagato wouldn't really have time to re-implant those Rinnegan rods into them because he died, and then he summoned the dog back as an Edo Tensei. But just the nature of them being immortal serves for us to understand that these things are probably very much unlike other regular summons like Gamabunta, for instance. We see that Gamabunta can get very hurt. When Pain uses Shinra Tensei and blasts him 1,000 miles away from the Leaf Village, he has to go back to Mao Miyaboku and get a billion bandages around his body to recover. My theory is that these Rinnegan beasts are simply chakra manifestations created by the Rinnegan. And sure, the animal path has to summon them as though you were summoning any other beast by teleportation, but it's something much more like creating the beast with the Rinnegan chakra than anything else. That would explain why they seem to be immortal, because technically they can die and you can just summon them again. And that also explains why they would try to go against Nagato's will. In the work, Nagato didn't want to fight against Naruto and B, because he was technically a good guy now. Just think about it, for example, if Jiraiya was brought back via Edo Tensei and he summoned Gamabunta, he wouldn't fight Naruto because he has his own will, and even though Jiraiya is trying to make him do so via Edo Tensei, Gamabunta would say, "No, you're being controlled by the Edo Tensei. I'm not fighting Naruto. You're wrong." He would probably try to seal Jiraiya with Naruto instead. But the beasts from the Rinnegan, they just obey Nagato's commands when he is an Edo Tensei, even though Nagato clearly doesn't want to harm Naruto or B. This supports this theory that they are actually not animals and simply creations of chakra, kinda like the tail beast, but in a much lesser degree. And that makes sense too, because if you remember how the tail beasts were created, it was Hagoromo using a jutsu called the Creation of All Things, where he splits the chakra of the 10 tails into the 9 tail beasts. And if the Rinnegan had something similar to that, creating beasts, but of course weaker versions of them with the Rinnegan, that would be an interesting callback to Hagoromo's ability. And then of course, because they were created by the Rinnegan, it's easy to assume that the rods already implanted into them when they come to life, and they already have the Rinnegan in their eyes. Watch this other video right here for more Rinnegan related content. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Like this video to help me against the YouTube algorithm, and thank you so much for watching.